welcome for the very last session here at Delphi Economic Forum 2023. And this session is entitled The Next Day of Western Sanctions Against Russia. My name is Joseph de Weck. I'm Europe Director at Greenmantle and a columnist on European politics. But you're here above all to hear our speakers. I want to start with Alex Cooley. He's a professor of political science at Columbia University. He's an expert on the politics of former Soviet states, and in particular on Central Asia and the Caucasus. But his writings span wider than that. He has written papers on sanctions policy in the context of the current war in Ukraine. And most importantly, he has written a book on the end of American hegemony that is incredibly timely in the current debate about sanctions and de-dollarization. We also have joining us from Lithuania, Margarita Šešelgytė. She is a director of the Institute of International Relations and Political Science in Vilnius and has written on sanctions and Ukraine, especially in the last year. And then we have here as well George Pagoulatos. He, I don't know how I should introduce you, but you're Director General of ELIAMEP, which is sort of the main think tank on foreign policy, European affairs here in Greece. You're also a professor, like Alex, and also a columnist, but above all, you have just gotten a new job at the OECD as Greece's ambassador in Paris, and I can congratulate you on that. Paris is a great city, my hometown. So I want to start with you, George, and take stock of sort of the sanctions so far. In June 2022, German Economy Minister Robert Habeck said, Russia's economy is collapsing, but Russia's economy is still standing. It only contracted by 2% last year. The IMF expects it to grow next year again, and Russia's war continues. So to ask, in a provocative sense, have Western sanctions on Russia failed?
Thank you very much, Joseph. Let me start by responding to your question by placing the framework. Yes, we have the sanctions. Yes, some of the most optimistic expectations about the impact they would have on the Russian economy have been proven wrong. Sanctions do not operate on a short-term manner. And there are ways of circumventing sanctions. This is the history of sanctions. So it is not surprising that these pathways around the sanctions have been found. And yes, the Russian economy is not collapsing with the extent that was predicted back in spring 2022. However, let's not forget that sanctions, first of all, is the only means of response for the European Union and the West to respond short of war, of a fully fledged war. So it was the only available instrument for a decisive response. And the West should have responded in the most decisive way, as it did, by continuing to arm Ukraine and by implementing the most severe economic damage that it can implement upon the Russian regime, because Putin must not be allowed to win this war, whatever that means and however one interprets that. In a way, it can be claimed that Putin has already been strategically defeated. I emphasize strategically, in the sense that what he expected to achieve through this barbaric attack upon Ukraine has not been achieved. So it was not a quick win as he expected. We are in a quagmire of 14 months with no impressive military gains on the ground for Putin. No regime change has been achieved in Kyiv. Quite the opposite, the national identity of the Ukrainians has been reaffirmed. It's much stronger than it has ever been. The EU is not divided, the West is not divided, as Putin expected. In fact, the European Union mobilized the most severe set of sanctions already on the 10th round very fast, and the West found a common voice and a common tune in addressing Russian aggression. And NATO has gained 2 new members. So this is not exactly a triumph for Putin. Sanctions are taking their toll slowly on the medium term. They are eroding the preconditions upon which the Russian economy and thus the Russian military might lies. Russia is already losing the best and the brightest. There is a very significant brain drain from Russia. There is a significant flight of enterprises and foreign investment from Russia, even if it is not complete. And there are exceptions to that, of course. And Russia, quite importantly, is losing its access to Western technology, which will be something that will come at a cost on the medium and longer run. Russia has traded its status as a regional power, or as it would like to believe, a global power, with the status of becoming a junior partner to China, fully dependent upon China. That's not exactly a geopolitical upgrade for Russia. And therefore, you could say that in the broader scheme of things, the sanctions as one of the instruments that have been employed by the West are working in marginalizing Russia at a global level, and in weakening its further ability to wage aggressive wars such as the one that we have seen, because if it cannot achieve its military aims vis-à-vis Ukraine, let alone against any NATO member country. Now, there is a downside to that, of course, because the West and the United States have spent decades seeking to prevent an alignment between China and Russia. This alignment is happening, it is a reality. We've had a united Western stance against Putin's aggression, but about 2/3 of the world population are not subscribing to the sanctions, and we have a revival of the BRICS. I was reading today on Bloomberg that the 19 new member states, new countries that have asked to join the BRICS, among them Egypt, Indonesia, and so forth. So there is a revival of what we used to call tiers-mondisme, or non-aligned movement, which is flocking around China, and Russia is part of this broader alignment. This is a broader feature of our multipolar world, and a multipolar world that resides within an order which is no more the rules-based multilateral order with which we have proceeded over the previous decades, because international law has been losing its credibility even more than it had before, following Putin's aggression against Russia, Putin's aggression against Ukraine.
That's a big topic that we're going to discuss as well, sort of the consequences of the sanctions for the global order. I want to turn now quickly to Lithuania, to Margarita, and ask how you see sort of the sanctions developing over the next months. We have a G7 meeting in Hiroshima where we discuss sanctions policy. The US is floating the idea of a general export ban towards Russia. Europeans are discussing possibly a 11 sanctions package that could contain also elements of secondary sanctions, or trying to prevent circumvention of sanctions. We have Kenneth Rogoff, the US Harvard economist, making the case for the Western alliance applying more secondary sanctions. Do you think Europe should go down that road, or what should be sort of the priority for Europeans and the West in future sanctions policy?
Thank you. I hope you hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so good afternoon. Hello from Lithuania. I think that it is important to see sanctions as just one instrument to punish Russia and to prevent unwanted behavior in the future. Although on one hand we see that sanctions were important symbolically as a political messaging of the European and in general Western unity, but they did not probably have such an impact which was expected, and they didn't prevent the future Russia's unwanted behavior. Then we have to make a question mark. Do we want increase sanctions even more? And if yes, so what is our aim? If our aim is to cripple Russian economy, so in the long run, sanctions might have expected effect, because we can see that the revenue from oil has substantially shrunk over the last year. I think it was around 8.4 billion US dollars over the last year. So there is less money to finance the war, and it is important, but it takes very slow. And the trends that we have been seeing recently are not very encouraging, because the longer we are in this situation, businesses and Russia as a regime tend to adapt. And then we've seen the substantial leaks, but also we've seen all the ways to circumvent existing sanctions regime. Countries like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, also Armenia, Georgia, those countries serve as intermediates to transfer the sanctioned goods to Russia. I'm just going to give you one example, which is very illustrative. Over the last year, the exports from Lithuania in one category, it's machines and dual use and advanced technologies, has increased by 20,387%. So what does it say? That the products which are not coming to Russia via the European countries are still coming to Russia through other ways. There are also stories how every Uzbekistan citizen now buys like 6 phones, and every Kazakhstan citizen has like 8 washing machines. So these goods go to Russia, and they take semiconductors from these goods and use for the purposes that European Union and the Western wanted to prevent. So I can see a lot of ways how sanctions are being circumvented. So that's intentional, but also there are all sorts of the not intentional misunderstandings. For instance, in Lithuania, we are very harsh in implementing sanctions, but we lack this ability to do this because we do not have an experience. So all these challenges, just the more you continue into the situation, the impact of sanctions is being reduced. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks a
Okay,
lot.
because I lost.
So I want to
Sorry, it's
pick
very
up.
difficult to talk over the Zoom. So
Okay.
what I'm trying to say is that talking about further amount of sanctions, we have to bear in mind that first, probably we have to address these problems, these leaks and circumventions, and then go on with the further, probably secondary sanctions and other sanctions.
Okay.
And the last point that I want to address, that sanctions has to be viewed as one tool in the package to prevent Russia's unwanted behavior. It has to go together with the legal procedures issued against the Russian regime and those culprits who, for the war crimes and for the beginning of war. For instance, the decision of ICC and financial and military support for Ukraine. So it is just one tool in this strategy.
Okay. I want to pick up that point. Margarita is making the case for focusing on implementing sanctions and enforcing that. What is your view on this, and what are the risks associated to going down that path?
Well, thanks very much for having me here. I agree with most of what's been said before. I'll just emphasize that I think we are responsible for overhyping, I think, what was possible with sanctions, right? We made sanctions, especially financial sanctions, seem at the outset as if they were some sort of kinetic warfare weapon, when in reality, there's something more akin to protracted warfare, right, in a stalemate. And so We saw very effective measures being taken by the Russian central bank to impose capital controls, increase interest rates, put blocks on foreign currency transactions, mandate Russian firms converting foreign exchange into rubles, and this anticipated collapse in the ruble recovered. Now, yes, it's artificial, yes, it's predicated on this intervention. So this is very much a long-term proposition, and if the goal of sanctions is to reduce the warfare capability of Russia over the long term, then perhaps we're more on track than this is sort of initial kind of overly optimistic prognosis. Going forward, though, we're going to have some very tough choices to make, and I really want to emphasize the re-export dilemma Margarita talked about, because the next stage in escalation, secondary sanctions, effectively goes to the realm of extraterritorializing what is, in essence, US law, possibly EU law. And this would mean that countries and companies would effectively have to choose between the US market, or access to the US and the Western markets, and access to Russia or Russia's orbit and the rest of the world, right? Now, this is a choice that strangled Iran, right? And I think part of the optimism over this was that the Iranian economy was commodity dependent. There were sort of clear understandings of sort of its trading routes and hubs and partners, and so you had this kind of strangulation effect. It is not at all clear to me over the long term what the impact of imposing secondary sanctions would be. I think we've threatened them, and just to give a couple of examples. So what do you do in a case where we see South Korean exports in technology to Russia down 40% year on year? South Korean exports to Kyrgyzstan, as Margarita mentioned, are up 250%. Right, now we're gonna threaten secondary sanctions against Kyrgyzstan. Well, Kyrgyzstan is already in Russia's orbit. Right, the point is that Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, these countries are using the Eurasian Economic Union, right, and the legal structures within it to engage in this re-export. So where do you identify the leaks? At which point in the supply chain? What do you do with Western companies that are unwittingly having their goods re-exported or being part of these sort of parallel structures? But I think the overall broader geopolitical point is, if we go down that route and we are prepared to sort of enforce them, not to just single out one particular firm for sort of opprobrium to sort of name and shame, then we're very much asking countries to make choices that they don't want to make, right? The majority of countries, as George said, non-aligned, but also wanting to have open doors to everyone, to Europe, the West, China, and Russia, and this would be upping the geopolitical stakes.
Many thanks. George, maybe you want to bounce back on this. What is sort of the world looking like after this sort of first big sanctions package? Are we moving? There's this big debate basically between Adam Tooze, the economic historian, and Neil Ferguson, and they're making this argument whether the world is deglobalizing or not. And one of the big arguments they're making is that because of sanctions, we are also moving in towards a more fragmented world. Is this what will be at one point sort of the inheritance of this war as well?
Well, we started from a trend of relative deglobalization following the effects of COVID. There was a tendency to repatriate parts of the supply chain in order to safeguard them, not yet from malign activities by third actors, but for safety reasons and for resilience purposes. And this has been further boosted as a result of the war and the sanctions that have followed. And we have a parallel decoupling process taking place on the part of the West and the aligned countries to the West, decoupling from Russia, very abrupt and very steep, which is about to stay. I cannot think of many scenarios under which Europe recovers its energy trade and its trade transactions, economic transactions with Russia, even after the war leaves, unless we have a significant regime change in Moscow. And decoupling from China, which had been a more slow brewing process, it is now one of the major issues on not just the US agenda, but also the European agenda. On the US agenda, how far with decoupling? And there is a recent sort of increase of the clarity, so we not fully decoupling, but certainly de-risking, and that is an agenda that Europe can live with. And then on the part of the European Union, how far do we align with any agenda being produced in Washington if we have a change of guard in the White House and a new majority of a Trumpian type? But this is a deeper problem lurking in the background. It also has to do with the discussion of strategic autonomy of the European Union, but we do live in a world which is a world of bifurcation and fragmentation of the kind of globalization that we knew at the height of globalization, the kind of 90s world. This started to crumble already after 2008, and we are already in the reverse process. This does not mean that we are in a world that is deglobalized, but we are in a world that is reversing the trend towards greater globalization, and in which multilateral institutions are not doing their job. I remind you that it is not just that the Security Council in the UN is not functioning symbolically and substantially, but it's also that the appellate court in the World Trade Organization is not functioning. So the global trade is not functioning, and it is clear that Europe and the West are pursuing safety in their supply chains either by repatriating parts of the supply chain or by friendshoring and nearshoring. And this is an agenda on which both the European Union and the United States are meeting, but are meeting, I would say, as economic competitors, because at the same time the US wants to repatriate investment into the US, and Europe wants the same into Europe. So it's a world where the European Union and the US need to remain closely aligned, need to maintain their alliance. I would say it should, on top of everything else, be an alliance in order to sustain a rules-based multilateral order, which is also an order that prevents the kind of polarization from developing into a dangerous escalation.
Alex, in 2022, you've written a book called Exit from Hegemony, The Unraveling of the American Global Order. Do you think that this is kind of what we're seeing today, accelerated by sanctions?
I do, and I think initially there was pushback and good debate about the book in that we had unprecedented Western unity, and so we saw financial sanctions, NATO expansion, all these things George mentioned, in the sense, well, you know, when the West is united, of course it's still this hegemonic cartel, is the term I like to use. But what we've seen over the last few months, I would argue, is this growing ambiguity towards the war in the global South is actually related to the drivers of Western unity, right? And so going forward, yes, certainly we mentioned secondary sanctions and their enforcement, but there are other issues too, right? When you think about the confiscation of assets, both at the sovereign state level and at the individual level, getting banks in third countries to comply with this is going to be enormously controversial. When you think about procuring 300, 350, 400 billion for Ukrainian reconstruction, whatever the number is, how is that going to play out in the global South? And, you know, to speak to the ICC indictment, yes, this is one mechanism of justice, but the ICC's record in certain parts of the global South is also politically controversial. So I think, you know, what Moscow wants to do is to change the conversation from what it did in Ukraine to look at all of the dysfunctions and hypocrisy and double standards in the liberal international order. And when I look forward in terms of sanctions and these other types of accountability and reparations, I think this is going to be a serious geopolitical challenge. How do you justify and how do you implement these kinds of extraterritorial measures?
Margarita, one aspect of the Ukraine war and its international dimension is also that we look at China and that it's always a bit seen also as a template, possibly, of what could happen with Taiwan. What do you think is China learning from sanctions policy over Ukraine? Do you think the example has increased deterrence or lowered it?
I think that China is following what's happening in Ukraine very meticulously, very carefully. and learning from all the steps that we make. And the very recent example of the reaction of China was, first of all, a very um, interesting announcement of the Chinese ambassador in France regarding the sovereignty of the post-Soviet republics, and then the reaction of the European Union countries, which was very harsh, and then China, official Beijing has denounced this. But prior to that, various European leaders, including Macron, were visiting China, and there was a message at some point which was a bit controversial, that probably there is no unity in the West, transatlantic unity, but also there is no unity among the European countries. And this message of the ambassador might be a testing ground of what China is trying to test, if this unity might crumble. So this is just one example. But in terms of sanctions, we have to admit that decoupling from China might be much more hurtful than decoupling from Russia, because our interrelations, interconnections with China are a lot bigger in Europe, but also not in Europe in general, in the West. And this might pose a very, very serious challenge. So that's one thing. Another thing, I think that in this war there are a lot of lessons learned. And one of the lessons, for instance, when Lithuania invited Taiwanese representation to be hosted in Vilnius, we had very harsh reactions by China. And on one hand, there were some official reactions, but also there were some reactions which were these undercarpet reactions, like China started to blackmail the companies which are working with Lithuania, Western companies, not to buy Lithuanian parts, which are important in the chains of supply, threatening not to allow those goods to arrive to China. So this was also a testing ground, and in that sense, European Union showed very, very strong unity, trying to protect Lithuania as a small member of the European Union, arguing that the trade policy is the competition of the European Union. And I think that China has learned this lesson. So unity is key in this war. And for West, it is very important to show this unity, for Russia, but also for China.
So thank you very much. I think we're basically running out of time. I think it's a moment where sanctions have never been applied to such a big economy. We've gone a very long way, and to some extent there's a disillusion to how powerful this tool really can be. So there will be a lot of lessons for history and economic historians that are going to look at this. Thank you very much for everyone being here and for this panel, taking time during lunchtime to listen to us, and thank you.